And I'll close out this really fascinating panel by talking about lead exposure and the relationship between that and violent crime, highlighting some research among others, including myself, and getting into more details into the specific paper I'm going to be talking about. But before I do that, I'd just like to draw attention to a really excellent roundup that Jim, who we just heard from, has done for Niskanen Center. And so here's the URL here. So I'd like to, there's a really excellent summary of all the recent work in this area. And some of the key findings in the papers that were highlighted by Jennifer in this article is: one, lead in drinking water increased homicide rates in the early 20th century, and that's using data across the US. It does appear that removing lead from gasoline reduced violent crime in the US. And there's some papers finding this across the US. And then third, there's some recent work that links exposure to lead as a child to school suspensions and juvenile delinquency in Rhode Island. So I'll refer you to Jen's article to get all the details on those papers. But I think, the general consensus in the recent work that really tries to uncover a causal relationship that is pointing towards very large and substantial effects of lead exposure early on in life and violent behavior later on in juvenile years as well as adult years. And so the paper that I'm going to be talking about today is one that we're not going to directly test this causal relationship between lead exposure and crime. Rather, we're going to be looking at the effect of an intervention that was targeting kids with high levels of exposure on their behavior, criminal activity as juveniles. And so this work is joint with Steve Billings. I'm Kevin Schnepel. I'm at Simon Fraser University up in British Columbia, Canada. And so I'm going to highlight some of the findings from this paper and then talk about the policy implications. So one thing that's important, I think, to mention is what are the sources of exposure and which sources are really the most important contributors to exposure today. Lead paint hazards are a really important source of exposure and continue to be so today, as well as water through drinking water systems. There's a lot of lead in old plumbing underneath our cities in the US. And so, this is highlighted by the crisis in Flint, Michigan and other cities, and that's an important source of exposure. There's a lot of lead in the soil across our urban areas, and that's, settled. It could be from chipped paint, but also settled lead from when petrol and gasoline used to have a very high content of lead, and that settled into the soil. So those are really important sources of exposure. The context that I'm going to be talking about really is focused on the lead paint hazards within older homes in the US. And so there's an estimate of about 1 out of every 4 homes in the US may contain a significant lead paint hazard, and that continues to be true today. The CDC recommends blood lead testing around 1 and 2 years old for all kids. Some states require these tests or proof of these tests when kids are entering into the school systems. But monitoring is a really important piece of this paper that I'm talking about today. But this monitoring of which kids might have been exposed is important, and that's part of the context here in the conversation going forward, I think, in terms of the policy implications. And so what typically happens across the US is that if these tests of young children reveals concerning levels of exposure, a combination of actions is recommended. And this can range from providing information to parents about exposure, the dangers of exposure, how to reduce exposure, to triggering remediation from, say, a HUD lead-based paint remediation funding program, to case management type approaches and developmental monitoring of kids that are testing high early on in life. And so what we're going to do in this paper is match these blood lead level test results, and this is all in Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. We've been able to match those testing results with the administrative school and arrest records and this is for children born between 1990 and 1997. An important note in terms of this context is Charlotte is a relatively modern city compared to a lot of other cities in the US. And so the lead paint hazard is lower in Charlotte than it is in a lot of other places. And so, we expect that these interventions are also having potential benefits in some of these other cities with higher risks of exposure. One thing I just want to point out, and this is not to the causality yet, and again, we're not going to get at this direct link between lead and violent behavior, but and this correlation has been documented in many different papers for many decades. If you look at the test results, and I'll draw your attention down here to the violent crime panel, these are just average violent crime arrests rates, in that juvenile period for individuals by the level of their blood lead test results. And you see this very almost monotonic increasing relationship. So as we see higher levels of exposure through these test results, we see higher rates of arrests for violent crimes. And it's quite striking, this gradient in this relationship. But one thing to note is that this isn't necessarily causal. There's a lot of other factors that could be correlated with higher levels of exposure in individuals who are living in these deteriorating homes or these disadvantaged neighborhoods and these types of arrest records. And so what we're trying to get at in this paper is what you see hinted at down here is in terms of evaluating this intervention that's going to target kids with really high levels of lead exposure as detected in these test results with this kind of package intervention. And what we're finding in our paper is a very dramatic decrease in the rate of arrests for especially the violent behavior as juveniles. So how are we going to get at the causal impact of this intervention, this CDC recommended intervention on criminal activity? We're going to use the fact that in North Carolina, what happens that if your test result, your initial test result is over what at the time was the alert threshold or the threshold of concern, 10 micrograms per deciliter, there will be an intervention, or if the first test is over, there's a second confirmatory test. And if that second test is over, then it qualifies that individual for an intervention. Whereas if that second confirmatory test is just under the threshold, that individual would not qualify for this intervention. And so what we're using here really is there's a lot of randomness in terms of how well these tests measure exposure in terms of, there can be measurement error, and most of these tests are finger prick tests, and it's well documented, there's a lot of measurement error in that. The test is going to measure exposure over a relatively recent period of time. And so depending on when the exposure shock happens, that there could be differences in whether kids are getting the second confirmatory test over versus not. And importantly, what we're seeing across all the things we can observe about these children in terms of those that have the two tests over versus those that have the first test over and the second one just under, is that they're observationally equivalent. So we see balance across the characteristics we can observe. And then our assumption is that the balance would also hold across a lot of the unobservable things that would be correlated or lead to different types of behavior later on in life. And so in this sense, our study here approximates a randomized controlled trial. So just to summarize the results very quickly, we find very substantial declines across most measures of criminal behavior for kids whose second test qualifies them for an intervention. And these effect sizes are quite big. If we look at the arrest here on average in the control group, so those with one test over and then one test just under that didn't qualify for the intervention, the average arrest rate is about 18%, or we see about 18% of those kids with arrest records as juveniles. This is about halving or decreasing that risk by about 40%. And for the violent arrest, it's an even bigger effect. And so again, these aren't necessarily a direct causal impact of lead on outcomes, but suggest that the CDC recommended response, which often includes reducing exposure risk within the household and kind of cutting off that continued exposure risk through these lead paint remediations, along with nutritional advice and a lot of other kind of a package of interventions. This work strongly suggests that this response can really reduce violent crime decades later. And so I think, it might be a nice paper to conclude this panel, because I think all the other talks we heard were very short-term responses to violent crime, which of course are important to think about and talk about given the climate today. But this really is more about long-term policy action that could prevent violent crime down the road. And so I thank you for your time. Any questions and comments are very welcome. Feel free to email me, look me up, and I'm happy to chat further.